So I'm going to dive straight in and introduce my first speaker, or your first speaker really, of the second session. Sergey is somebody who I met through a mutual friend of ours who worked with Sergey at a digital agency just up the road in the trendy part of London where those sort of companies gather now. Sergey has been a project and program manager there for some time, worked on some very, very large projects for sort of big organizations who are doing huge sort of digital overhaul projects with huge numbers of stakeholders and agendas probably at play at any one time. So I've asked Sergey if he can come and talk to us a little bit about that world, about managing projects with mind mapping. And again, Sergey was someone who I just met purely coincidentally, really. And he said, oh yeah, I'm using mind mapping. It's a great sign for me when I meet someone who I don't have to explain what I do right from the what is a mind map piece. So I'm going to introduce Sergey and get you to come up and speak to us, Sergey, and we'll have some questions at the end, no doubt, as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Liam. I'll just take 1 second to wake my computer up. Yes, we're going to explore the exciting world of project management today a little bit. Thank you all for being here. The title of this talk today is going to focus on the structure and how introduction of structure and maintaining structure throughout the project process helps project succeed, and predominantly, obviously, how utilization of mind mapping process and the techniques helps that as well. So just a couple of words about myself for you to better understand my background. I work in digital, like Liam mentioned. I have been in this sector for a number of years now, and I moved around a bit as well as a contractor, so I've seen many clients, many agencies, and many teams. And the examples that I'm going to be using in the talk, they come from my observations over this period of time. And I am a mind mapper since 2006, so also for quite a period of time, and have been using the software and the techniques quite extensively, although I will confess I'm not the advanced user. I'm not using all the features that are available. But I do use the mind maps for a very, very distinct purpose. And I'm going to show you within this talk, we're going to look at a couple of use cases that are very specific, that are embedded into the project process. They have their place in it, and very contextual, basically. They are going to be from day to day as well, so it's very common. It happens all the time. This is how I sort of structured the talk today. It's going to have 3 main sections. I first am going to talk about project risks in general, where they come from, how to deal with them. And then we're going to look at 2 use cases, very typical. And what I tried to do is look at the processes from 2 different angles. The first use case is going to be how we're going top-down from a central subject into more details, which is quite natural for mind mapping. And the second one is going to be completely the other way around, bottom-up. We're going to look at how you start with masses and masses of information and data, and then introduce order and bring it all together in the end. So very quickly, in terms of project risks, because we care about project health, we need to ask ourselves what that is. In my opinion, a healthy project is risk-free, which is never achievable, to be honest, because we live in the real world, and risks do occur. Where they come from gray areas. So if you have a project, if you're starting something new, and you know the work ahead of you, and you know a fair bit, but not everything, where you have the unknowns are your risks, and you should look into that more closely. It's even more so in digital, because digital projects tend to be quite complex. There is a lot of moving parts, and there's literally hundreds and hundreds of tasks that the team needs to accomplish. It's also very relevant because the use cases that I'm going to talk about and the activities that take place every single time on every project, you have to face this and you have to solve this problem. My observation is that generally people struggle with risks. People find it difficult dealing with risks and finding the solution, keeping track of them, identifying them, and so on. And there is a number of reasons for it. It's completely understandable. We're all human beings. We have distractions. There's lots of things in our day-to-day work that fight for our attention. We all have emotions, and sometimes if we get overly excited in a positive way about something we do, we rush forwards, which unfortunately leads to mistakes often. And it takes a bit of skills as well to deal with risks, because many problems on projects, from my experience again, are to do with poor communication, and not everyone is a great communicator, sadly. So because of these reasons, it's difficult. What I find, again, is that structure helps that. It helps overcome such problems and minimize the risks. In a number of ways, it gives you techniques and tools that you can use, and that can almost guarantee predictable results, which is very helpful. It helps you hunt down those gray areas and find them quickly and early, so that you get time to look into those. And it eliminates misinterpretation, because if you're using the means of communication that everybody's familiar with, because it's structured, then everybody's on the same page. So that's about the project risks. Just to quickly recap, healthy project is a risk-free project. Generally, people struggle with risks, and structure helps overcome this issue. Now, the interesting part, the use case that I often see happening, and I usually look after myself, it's top-down planning. Planning literally means project planning in this case. So when you are starting a new project, you need to understand what it is that it consists of in order to make it happen, in order to drive it as well. So the goal of the planning exercise is to itemize the work. You start with the big idea, what you are supposed to achieve in the very end, but you need some traceability, some transparency to track progress, and you need to have separate distinct work packages to be able to assign it to different people, different teams, and coordinate the work. When people do that, there is a certain convention, something that I've seen happening over and over again. They tend to go to the tools they are already familiar with. So if you ask your project manager to do some planning, chances are they're going to use one of these, either Microsoft Word, where they can outline at a high level what the project is supposed to consist of, or they can draw a diagram in something like Microsoft PowerPoint or Keynote, or sometimes they go straight into Microsoft Project because they consider themselves being very good at planning. Also happens. So this comes with risks of their own. First of all, when you're trying to break it down, a big subject into small pieces, it takes quite a bit of knowledge of the subject matter to get it right. So if you're unsure, if you're not an expert, then it's very easy to miss something, basically. As simple as that. Secondly, I mentioned you break it down in order to be able to assign it to different people. But that, again, carries a risk because this ownership might be unclear sometimes. An example of this is in the agency world, you always have this agency-client relationship. And when you are starting a project for your client, you're trying to set some boundaries to the scope. What is the work that I'm responsible to deliver? And I'm going to give an example from the digital world because that's where my background is. A website build project, for instance. It normally consists of doing some design work, writing some code because it's a software essentially, but it also requires content and it requires infrastructure. So these two things often are being delivered by the client, and it's a very common assumption to make for the agency, but it's not always true. Your client might have a different understanding. And whatever you produce when you plan needs to reflect that somehow. So how does enforcing structure help that process is the question. Project management as a discipline is a fairly well-established thing, and there is there are methodologies that govern this process. One of them is Prince2, really widespread in the UK. And one of the controls of that method is called product breakdown structure. And this is what it looks like. So again, that example I just mentioned, we're building a website, and at a high level, we have 4 main components, and each component can be broken down further. So you start with the end product, with the final product that you need to get in the end. Understand what it consists of, then take each component, break it down further, take each subcomponent, break it down further, and that way you achieve the necessary granularity for you to manage the work. Now the question is, what does it look like? It looks like a mind map. And the reason it looks like a mind map is because it uses exactly the same principles. It pushes you to create a diagram that is visual, because that helps absorb the information. It prompts you to follow and stick to quite strict hierarchy, and it pushes you to connect everything, to have no floating items, because you want these connections to emerge. You want to understand these relationships. So to me, for instance, it only seemed natural to actually use mind mapping software to build a product breakdown structure, but it doesn't happen very often with other people. In my mind, using this trick actually does address those risks that I mentioned before. So for instance, it's pretty hard to miss an item if you're following that process of breaking it down from the central ultimate product. The way mind mapping software works suits perfectly and matches that. You do avoid floating items very easily because it's not very comfortable to have a lot of them in the mind mapping software. So floating items constantly want to get linked to something else, which really helps in this particular scenario. You can also label the owners. So if you want to identify responsibilities for chunks of work, then again, it's very easy to do it in the mind mapping software. And it can reflect relationships between the different components. You do gain efficiency as well as you're doing this in mind mapping software, as opposed to other diagramming tools. It's super easy to move the objects around. The formatting happens automatically once you've established a theme. Super features that I really enjoy using is expanding and collapsing of the mind map, as well as drilling down where you focus on a particular component and make that a central topic. And obviously in this example you can also see how you can visually reflect the relationships and the grouping. So that's the first use case, and just to recap on the key points, product breakdown structure is effectively a mind map already. It does address the planning risks as they stand, and Xmind is just an example of software I use for mind mapping. It suits this task so much better than Word or PowerPoint. Moving on to the second use case, it's going to be a process going bottom up, the opposite direction, and I'm using the audit activity on the project, which is specifically content audit. So what happens very often is when you're starting a web build project, you're not starting from scratch. There's normally a legacy website that the business has, and your task is to transform it, redesign it, migrate it to a new technical platform. Whatever the rationale, you have this starting point. So when you're supposed to arrive to how the new website, what shape it's supposed to take, you ask your content strategist or a user experience designer to do the audit of information that is supposed to go in. And it's pretty clear to everybody that it needs to be restructured, so that structure has to change. It's content that matters, not how it's structured at the moment. And the goal of this process is to arrive to this information architecture, which resembles itself in a site structure, essentially. That's the goal. Again, there will be a certain convention, a very clear pattern of what people would do when they're given such task. If it's a designer, and 9 times out of 10 it is, they will go and use some kind of a diagramming software to build such a structure. It can be omnigraphal if they're on a Mac, or a Microsoft Visio if they're on a PC. And this is a result of such exercise. This is what they're likely to produce. It doesn't matter what it says. Don't worry about that. What I'm trying to point out here is that it does look like a mind map. And it does have the structure, and it does have the boxes and the connectors and everything. But if you start looking closely, you might find it quite confusing, because there is a color code applied here, and you have to realize and understand what the different color means. And sometimes they use indentation to supposedly reflect hierarchy, but sometimes they don't. So the objects that seemingly belong to the same level give you reasons to think they don't. And that basically opens this up for misinterpretation. So the risks that exist in this case are hierarchy might be unclear. The second thing is this map might also be incomplete, because what happens is designers create this diagram so that they can take it with them into all the numerous meetings with all the stakeholders that they know are going to happen, and they want to have a discussion around it. So they push the information to fit into one page. And in doing so, they omit certain things that they think are not important. But that does a bad favor down the stream, sadly. And the third thing about such a diagram is that once you've spoken to all these stakeholders, they have feedback, they have their own opinions, and they push you to change things. As you're making those amends to the diagram, it's very easy to make a mistake if the diagram was built in PowerPoint or OmniGraphal or something like this. Because you have to reapply all the formatting manually. It's a very manual process. So again, how do we enforce structure to that? We will get to mind mapping software. But in this process, you start with something else. Because it's bottom-up, normally, you need something called card sorting, because your starting point is lots of small bits that you have to organize. And what people do is they basically use sticky notes on the whiteboard, put them all up, write down all those items, and then try to find commonalities and group those notes together, and then identify the patterns and the linking between them. Inevitably, at some point in this process, you would want to move this information from the whiteboard to something, a different environment that is more dynamic, that allows you to manipulate this information more easily. That is where mind mapping software comes in. Yes, I do believe that floating items are evil. In the context of these particular scenarios, you don't want to have a lot of them, because linking things together is the whole point. And again, mind mapping software prompts you to do exactly that. Also, because the formatting is almost automatic in the mind mapping, there's going to be many people that are already familiar with that, and you don't have to explain, you don't have to create custom legends or anything like this. And you can expect people to read this correctly. Remember one pager that I mentioned? You can easily achieve it with the mind map because of the collapsing function that it has. So you can still have a single document, one copy, which contains all the detail, and still achieve a very, very brief view if you need it for the presentation purposes. It also allows you to not make silly mistakes when you are implementing changes into this structure, and you are moving things around, you're merging branches, you change the level of hierarchy, the formatting happens automatically for you. And again, that reduces risks that you carry. So just to recap on this scenario, sitemap diagrams often confuse hierarchy because it's a manual process of building them. The tools that you pick for this task are supposed to help you deal with the masses of data. So that's what you should be thinking about when you're picking a tool. And mind maps are dynamic enough, and yet they are support this rigor that you need in this context so much. So this is, I guess, what I wanted to show you in details. And just in conclusion, very quickly, the tasks that I talked about really are just recurrent tasks that can benefit from added structure. And the key point, I guess, is that you can find similar things in your own field. Whenever you have something that happens over and over again, and that requires structure, that's probably where you might be using and benefiting from using mind mapping software. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. That's great. I think my that I've scribbled to myself is a phrase I hadn't really thought about, which is hunting down grey areas. I think that's a great phrase. It's a really great phrase. And it's a really useful process that's enabled by mapping, and it is about drilling down just one more step, just one more step, just one more step.
Exactly.
The other thing that I find fascinating is one of the things that I'm sure anybody who does mind map training of any sort in the room, probably one of your biggest frustrations is when people say to you, I can't do mind mapping, it's really unstructured and messy. It's totally incorrect. Part of the benefit of mind mapping comes from the structure that it puts behind your ideas and your information, so it's very interesting.
Precisely.
Are there any questions for Sergey? There's Gerard over in the corner, who I understand is a project manager, so this could be a good question.
Sorry, Sergey, he said I had to ask you a question about project management. Okay, so
that's cool.
I'm new to mind management software, anyway, mind mapping software, but I want to apply it to project management. Now, having seen a work breakdown structure that covers an A3 bit of paper and still there's minuscule writing on it that I can barely see, I'm really interested in this idea of being able to put all the information in there without overburdening people with too much information, because if you're briefing at a high level, you want to give them the salient points, whereas when you're getting down to briefing the team about an installation, say, you want to be able to give them the detail. How, just if you can, just give us an example of how you make that work with using mind mapping software.
So from many speakers in this conference, I think you already heard, and you'll probably hear more later today, is that mind mapping is a technique that really helps collaboration. So it's getting people in a group, standing in front of a board and thinking together and discussing things. From that perspective, what I tend to do very often is just use mind mapping for a very short period of time to arrive to this structure. Then I take this information away into other vehicles, I use other documents, other artifacts. That being said, you can still totally stick to the mind mapping document, specifically because of that feature that I mentioned, drilling down. So when it comes to briefing a particular team within your wider project team maybe, they're supposed to, I would assume, they will focus on a particular area. So you can basically hide away everything else, zoom in into that subject, and use information in that subject that is going to fill up the entire screen or whatever vehicle that you're using. So that's entirely possible both ways.
Any other questions?
Thank you. iMindMap software has the ability to turn the map that you've created into a hierarchical structure which matches it in a kind of Gantt chart at one and the same time. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering whether either you or indeed anyone else in the room has any significant experience of using that and how effective it is to manage the switch that the last questioner was asking about.
Thank you. That's quite an obvious thing to do. As soon as you spot that feature, and many people do, and it's different software packages that have it, I saw it. I don't use it. I don't use it for a reason. It's just because where I used mind mapping is breaking the project down, and that's just one step of the planning. What happens next, according to that same methodology, is product flow diagram, which is where you identify dependencies between all your sub-products, and you work out the logical sequence in which they have to be produced. That presumably also might include activities, which is something that you don't get in the PBS. So there's going to be an interim step. Eventually, you can still get there, but it's just a slightly different exercise, and you need to note down the information that is being discussed in the room in a slightly different way as well. So that particular example didn't help you see that, and that's why.
You can do task dependencies in a lot of these software products. So
yeah.
you can go from there seamlessly to the next step. And
Totally.
the point you made about when you were doing that early part of the work for your content with your sticky notes, again, there are extensions in these software products that allow you to view your mind map or start your mind map in that type of mode. So the person doesn't see it as a mind map, but sees it as a set of sticky notes, familiar perhaps to that type of person or that role, and that can then just be interpreted immediately, grouped into a mind map.
That's nice. I haven't come across that.
I think it's really interesting about Sergey's presentation, and hopefully those of you who are new to mind mapping in the room, you can just see the feature set that Sergey is using. Sorry, I just do that. Sorry.
What I was just saying is, for those of you who are new to mapping, but also those of you who know it very well, what I think is fantastic is the simplicity of the feature set Sergey is using. He's probably using about 5% of the Xmind features, but it's absolutely a critical step in a process, and that's what we quite often are trying to say to people. These software guys are coming up with fabulous stuff. First of all, we've got to get people understanding that that simplicity of that simple feature set is really just so powerful in itself. So it's a nice way to see it just being used very simply. There's a lot of extra layers we can add onto that for sure, but I think the simplicity of that basic hierarchy structure is amazing. So I'm going to say, Sergey, thank you very much. I'm going to try and keep us back on time, but thank you, Sergey.